Hi. Now that we've learned about forming keywords and um, coming up with our working thesis and everything, now we're ready to start learning about what scholarly sources are. And then you'll have a lesson on using the library database. We will talk about other types of sources next week. This week, we're just looking at scholarly sources. And as a reminder, in your paper, you'll need at least two scholarly sources. So let's talk about what a scholarly source is. A scholarly source is found in the database. However, not all sources from the database are scholarly. So it's important to follow this up with learning how to use the database, and I'll walk you through the differences. It's also helpful to know ahead of time what is considered a scholarly source. So our database has subscriptions to newspapers and everything, magazines, reviews, but all of those are not scholarly. Scholarly source is academic. It's written by experts and scholars in a field, usually for other scholars and experts. So if something is on psychology, it's probably written by a psychologist. Something in a medical journal is written by someone who has either done medical research or is a physician or both. Some books are also considered academic, but and scholarly, some are not. And we'll talk about how to figure out which is which. So, an autobiography or a memoir may be a really good source, but it may not be scholarly. Uh, these go through a rigorous peer review process. It can also be called a refereeing process. This process can take quite some time. And during this process, they will go through and they will fact check. They'll replicate all of the experiments if possible. They'll check the numbers if a study is used. If sources are cited, they will go through and double check that the citations are correct and that they're not taken out of context. All of these things. A scholarly source will have rigorous checking, which means the downside is it can kind of take a while. Um, I have a chapter that I finished 2 years ago, for example, that's coming out in a scholarly text on female characters in Supernatural. And um, that book hasn't even come out yet because it's still going through the editing and peer review process. So it does take some time, which can be the downside. And we'll talk about when to use non-scholarly sources next week. These, however, are the most credible sources. They're the most reputable sources. They're the most trustworthy sources because of that. Um, Often when we look for articles, what we wind up using are popular articles. Um, However, those are not the same thing as a scholarly article because they're not necessarily written by the same scholars or researchers or professionals. They only use illustration if the illustration is significant. They're longer. They can be more narrow, and they'll have full citations. The cited sources should also be credible. So that's why you want to use these scholarly sources. Let's talk about what a scholarly source looks like and how to read them. Reading a scholarly source is not necessarily the same as reading a non scholarly source. For example, scholarly sources are really long, and often we think that we should just read them beginning to end, just like any other source. That's not necessarily always the case. And here's an example, and I'll tell you why. The first thing is there are going to be so many sources that come up in the database. You're not going to be able to read them all. So if the first thing you're going to look at is the title. These do not have catchy titles that are meant to draw the reader in. Often the title says exactly what the article is about. So if the title doesn't relate to your source, to what you're talking about, to your working thesis, then you don't need it. Um, Under that, there will also be, you'll see the authors, and usually the author information will include their affiliations and how to contact them. If it's an article, if it's a book, it's going to be a little different, where that information will be at the end of the book. Publication information will be at the bottom, where you can see where it's published and citation information, all of that. They will usually have an abstract, and This video is going to be shared with 101 and 102. For 102, abstract is what we just used. It's what you use in APA, so you all are familiar with it. 101, if we haven't yet talked about abstracts. An abstract is basically a summary of what's going to be in the article you're about to read. So if you're looking at something in the database and the abstract doesn't work for you, then you don't have to read it. The next thing you read is the introduction. The introduction will go through and talk about what this article is about, things like that. After that, there will usually be a section on the study if it's a scientific journal with findings. There may be charts and equations. That I've usually skim over because I'm not a scientific experimental person. It's not something I'm very familiar with. However, sometimes I will go back and read it depending on what the study is and how well it's explained. I do, however, want to read, there will be a findings section underneath this, and it'll be a summary of the findings of the study. Often that's in the body text. I'll definitely read that because that's basically telling me what all those numbers mean. Then I'll look at the conclusions. This is not just the conclusion of the article, but it's also a summary of what this means, all of that. And then the references page. Often if I'm looking for other sources, I find the sources I'm using from the references page on the article, and I use that a lot. Not all books are scholarly, and I linked, if you download the PowerPoint, you can copy this link and paste it into your search engine of choice, and the article will come up. But basically, not all books are scholarly. You want to look at the publisher. Is this someone who publishes everything, like Random House or Scholastic, where they'll publish a wide range of books? Or is it a publisher that only publishes scholarly books? In the realm of pulp culture, for example, I tend to look at books by McFarland Publishing because they only publish scholarly books that tend to be about pop culture. You can take a look at the publisher's website. You can search it up. University presses maybe scholarly, can often be scholarly, but sometimes they'll publish creative works, things like that. University of Kentucky, for example, will publish both scholarly and non-scholarly. Does the author have credentials, or the editor if it's a collection of multiple authors? There should be biographies of the author within the text. And are sources cited, and does the content seem free of bias? Is there a preface or an introduction? Is there a table of contents, an index to find specific terms, things like that? Those all suggest that they understand this book is meant for a scholarly audience that may not be reading from cover to cover. So the index is usually used to let readers flip through, or researchers to flip through to find information on what they're looking at. This is an example of a scholarly book. It's published by McFarland. Again, they're a scholarly publisher. You can't really see McFarland in this screenshot of the book, but on the side of the book or in the first page, you would see that publisher. They are a scholarly publisher. I know that by looking at their website, and because that's where a book I'm being published in is going to be published. They do a lot on popular culture. All of their books are peer reviewed and fact checked, and I can tell that from the website and things like that. They may be more reader friendly than other scholarly publishers, because they know that people who read them may also be people who are interested in pop culture. I would also look up these authors. They have edited quite a few collections about supernatural in general, but also other things, and they have published a good, rich publication history. The foreword is an actor that's on the show, so that may not tell me anything. He played Death, or the first Death, in the series. And the afterword is by Lynn Zubernis, who, if I looked her up, I would find out that she was an expert. She is a psychologist who does a lot of research into psychology and pop culture, particularly with supernatural. Other scholars you may find yourself interested in are Travis Langley, who does a lot with pop psychology, so pop culture and psychology. So if any of your interests fall into those realms, he may be someone to look up. With finding scholarly sources, you're going to start with your working thesis and you're going to come up with keywords from that working thesis, synonyms, possible subtopics, related topics. One thing you'll notice is that our library database, as well as many databases, are not quite as intuitive as Google. So Google will automatically search for any synonyms. So if I looked up ghost, it may look up ghost, haunting, spirits, things like that. Our database does not. So you want to try to come up with as many other terms that may be used, terms that may be related topics, things like that. And there's a worksheet that you'll be able to look at that'll help guide your search strategy before you even start using the database after viewing this lesson. So let's say this is my working thesis. I'm going to look up Steven Universe, LGBTQ representation, queer representation, younger viewers. And I may have to try out a few different terms to find something that works. The important part with forming a research strategy before looking for scholarly sources is that you just want to be able to have as many search terms ahead of time as possible. Other thing you're going to find really familiar are Boolean indicators. They're going to be really helpful. These are words and they need all the words need to be in caps. So and between words means that both words must be used. So if I'm looking at Steven Universe, I may look Steven and Universe. And if I put and between those words, then all of my searches are going to come up with something that has both words in the title or in the search results. It may not be the exact order that I'm looking for, and that's what we'll talk about in a minute with quotation marks comes into play. Or is the next one, says that either word is fine. So if there's synonyms, I may look up supernatural and television or series. So maybe looked up television shows or television series. Not between the words will tell the engine to omit searches with the terms after the word not. So if I'm looking up Steven Universe, I may find words, a lot of searches that come up with universe that maybe like astrophysics. So I can put not and then astrophysics, and nothing with astrophysics is going to pop up. Quotation marks around a phrase, so more than one word, tells the search engine to only search for that exact phrase in that order. So I could put quotation marks around Steven Universe, and then it's going to only show me things that have those two words in that order together. And that's it. I know this was kind of short on scholarly sources. There is another reading that you can refer to. And then after this, you'll do your worksheet or at least view the worksheet and come up with your search plans. And then the next lesson will be on, or the next part of this lesson will be on using the library database. If you have any questions as always, please let me know, and happy writing.